Along the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana lies a document that has confounded historians for more than a century. A single piece of parchment filed in the autumn of 1852. It records something that should have been impossible under every law of the antebellum South. A man named Moses, once enslaved on the Bellerive Plantation, somehow became the legal owner of that very estate just 8 months after the death of his master. But the story does not end there. In an act that defied every code of race, class, and religion of the time, Moses married his former master's widow, a white woman from a prominent Creole family, only 40 days after the funeral. The parish clerk who recorded their marriage license scribbled a single line in the margin, "God have mercy on us all." Within the first year of Moses' astonishing rise, 6 people who had openly questioned his sudden power were dead, each under suspicious circumstances that local authorities seemed in no hurry to investigate. His late master, Henry Boson, was found seated with a rifle across his lap, declared a suicide despite the contradictions buried in a sealed coroner's report. 2 white overseers who defied Moses' authority both perished within months. A parish priest who dared to confront him was thrown from his horse in what officials called a riding accident. By 1853, Moses Beauchamp, the name he took after marrying the widow, commanded one of the richest estates in Ascension Parish. But behind the grandeur of his newfound empire lingered a question that chilled all who whispered his name. How many lives were taken to make this transformation possible? Before we follow the trail of Moses Beauchamp and the blood-soaked path that carried him from the slave quarters to the master's house, consider this: was he a man of destiny, or something far darker born of vengeance and fate? Subscribe to this channel if you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of American history, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. This is a story that was deliberately buried for generations, and your engagement helps bring these forgotten truths to light. The events I'm about to share with you have been pieced together from parish records, personal letters, account books, and testimony given during a closed inquiry that few people know ever existed. What happened at Belleair Plantation challenges everything we think we know about power, loyalty, and survival in the Old South. Belleair Plantation stood on a bend of the Mississippi River in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, where the soil ran black and rich enough to grow sugarcane that fetched premium prices in New Orleans. The estate sprawled across nearly 800 acres, its boundaries marked by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss that seemed to absorb the heavy Louisiana air. The main house rose 3 stories tall, built in the French colonial style with wide galleries wrapping around each floor, tall windows that opened to catch the river breeze, and columns that had weathered hurricanes for 3 generations. Henry Beauchamp had inherited Belleair from his father in 1838, along with 63 enslaved people, a sugar mill that processed cane from neighboring plantations, and debts that would have crushed a lesser man. But Henry was not a lesser man. He was ambitious, calculating, and possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that recognized opportunity in places others saw only obstacles. By 1850, he had expanded his holdings to 92 slaves, paid off his father's debts, and established himself among the parish's planter elite. His success stemmed partly from agricultural innovation. He was among the first in the region to adopt steam-powered equipment for his sugar mill, but more significantly from his willingness to observe and learn from those he owned. Moses had been born on Belleair in 1822, the son of a woman named Patience who worked in the main house and a father whose name was never recorded in the estate books. From childhood, Moses displayed qualities that both fascinated and unsettled those around him. He learned to read by watching Enner's children study with their tutor, memorizing lessons through the parlor window. He taught himself carpentry by observing the plantation's craftsmen, then surpassed their skill before his 15th birthday. He understood crop rotation, weather patterns, and the complex economics of sugar production better than many overseers. Most remarkably, he possessed an ability to read people, to understand their fears, desires, and weaknesses with an accuracy that seemed almost preternatural. Henry Beauchamp recognized Moses' intelligence early and made a decision that most planters would have considered dangerous. He gave Moses responsibility, first as a driver overseeing field hands, then as a mill operator, and eventually as his personal assistant in managing the estate's business affairs. He kept Moses close, relied on his judgment, trusted him with information that other slaves never accessed. It was an arrangement that benefited both men. Ori's profits increased significantly under Moses's efficient management, while Moses gained knowledge and influence impossible for someone in his position. But there was a complexity to their relationship that outsiders could not fully perceive. Henry's wife Celeste had arrived at Bel Air in 1845, the 19-year-old daughter of a declining Creole family in New Orleans. Her father had accumulated gambling debts that threatened to destroy the family's reputation, and marrying her to the wealthy Henry Bostrom, 15 years her senior, had been a strategic solution. Celeste brought beauty, refinement, and social connections to Bel Air. She brought no affection for her husband. The plantation's social structure in 1852 Louisiana was rigidly defined by law and custom, yet within that rigid structure existed countless subtle negotiations of power. The white overseers, men like Tobias Greenleaf and his brother Samuel, officially held authority over all enslaved workers. But in practice, Moses wielded more influence. He controlled access to Henry-managed work assignments and maintained the account books that tracked every aspect of plantation operations. The Greenleaf brothers resented this arrangement deeply, but Henry dismissed their complaints with a pragmatism that infuriated them. Moses made him money, and money mattered more than their wounded pride. The household staff included 12 people who worked in the main house, and they occupied a strange middle ground in the plantation's hierarchy. Louisa, who had served as Henry's nurse when he was a child and now managed the household, commanded respect from both white and black residents. Her daughter, Margot, worked as Celeste's personal maid and occupied a position that gave her intimate knowledge of the mistress's private life. The kitchen was ruled by old Jacku, a man of indeterminate age who had cooked for 3 generations of Bon and whom everyone treated with cautious deference. By the spring of 1852, Bel Air appeared to be thriving. The previous harvest had been exceptional. Henry had negotiated favorable contracts with New Orleans factors, and the plantation's reputation attracted buyers willing to pay premium prices. The main house hosted dinner parties where parish elite gathered to discuss politics, cotton futures, and the growing tensions between North and South. Henry spoke passionately about states' rights and the Southern way of life, never acknowledging the irony that his eloquent defenses of that way of life were often informed by observations and insights Moses had shared with him earlier that same day. But beneath this prosperous surface, tensions were building that would soon tear Bel Air apart. Moses had spent 30 years watching, learning, and waiting. He understood the plantation's operations better than Henry himself. He knew which neighboring planters were on the verge of bankruptcy, which factors in New Orleans could be manipulated, which laws could be exploited, and which people could be influenced. He had been preparing for something, though few suspected what or when it would come. What no one fully understood, what perhaps even Moses himself did not fully understand until it was too late, was how completely the plantation's careful hierarchy would collapse once a single crucial element was removed. The entire structure of Bel Air rested on Henry Bozam's authority, and that authority rested on nothing more substantial than tradition, law, and the collective agreement that it should be so. Remove that foundation and everything built upon it would have to be renegotiated. The summer of 1852 would reveal just how fragile that foundation truly was. The evening of June 17, 1852 began like countless others at Bel Air. The day's heat had been oppressive even by Louisiana standards, driving everyone to seek shade by mid-afternoon. Ora Champ had spent the day reviewing account books with Moses, going over figures for the upcoming planting season, and discussing a potential land purchase from a neighboring planter whose son's gambling debts had grown unmanageable. They had worked in Ori's study, a room on the second floor of the main house that overlooked the river, its windows open to catch whatever breeze might stir the thick air. Celeste had complained of a headache and remained in her chambers for most of the day, attended only by Margot. This was not unusual. Celeste frequently retreated from the household, claiming various ailments that required privacy and rest. The household staff had learned not to disturb her during these episodes, though Louisa sometimes muttered that a woman who ate so little and slept so much was inviting illness rather than recovering from it. At 1700, Henry dismissed Moses and called for his evening meal to be brought to his study. He had letters to write, he said, and preferred to work undisturbed. This, too, was not unusual. Ori often conducted business correspondence in the evening, particularly during the planting and harvest seasons. Louisa supervised as Jacku prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of HR's preferred claret. Margot carried the tray upstairs, knocked on the study door, received HR's acknowledgement, and left it on the table just inside the entrance. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from testimony given during the inquiry, though significant gaps remain in the account. At approximately 9:30, Tobias Greenleaf, making his evening rounds of the property, noticed that lamplight still burned in Henry's study. This detail would later prove important, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. At some point between 9:30 and 1100, someone entered Henry's study. The door had been locked from the inside, but whoever entered possessed either a key or the ability to persuade Henry to unlock it. At 11:45, Louisa was awakened by a sound she described as something heavy falling. She rose, lit a candle, and made her way through the dark house toward Henry's study. The door stood slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed when she passed by earlier and lamplight spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open and saw Henry Boschamp slumped in his desk chair, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, his hunting rifle across his lap, and a significant amount of blood on the wall behind him. Louisa's scream brought the household running. Within minutes, Moses, Celeste, Margot, the Greenleaf brothers, and several house servants had gathered in the study. The scene appeared straightforward. Henry had shot himself with his own rifle, the barrel placed beneath his chin. The weapon was one he kept mounted above his desk, a Kentucky long rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Powder burns marked his chin and throat, and the bullet had exited through the top of his skull, lodging in the ceiling beam above. Tobias Greenleaf immediately assumed command of the situation, as was expected given his position as senior overseer. He ordered everyone except Samuel out of the room, then dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. Matthias Fentress from his home 5 miles distant. He questioned Lysia about who had been in the house that evening and who might have heard anything unusual. He examined the study for signs of disturbance and found none. No overturned furniture, no indication of struggle, no forced entry. Dr. Fentress arrived shortly after 1:00 in the morning. He examined the body briefly, confirmed the obvious cause of death, and estimated that Henry had been dead approximately 2 to 3 hours. He noted the powder burns, the trajectory of the bullet, and the position of the body. His initial conclusion, recorded in his notes, was suicide. However, he also observed several details that troubled him enough to include them in a separate, more detailed report he would later submit to the parish coroner. First, Henry's hands showed no powder residue beyond what one would expect from recently handling the rifle. Second, the rifle had been found across Henry's lap in a position that seemed awkward for someone who had just used it to shoot himself. Third, a bottle of claret on the desk was nearly empty, but Henry was known as a moderate drinker who rarely consumed more than 2 glasses with dinner. Fourth, and most disturbing, Henry's face bore an expression that Dr. Fentress struggled to characterize. Not the blank emptiness of sudden death, but something that resembled profound surprise mixed with what the doctor could only describe as recognition, as if Henry had understood something important in his final moment. The household spent the remainder of that night in a state of controlled chaos. Celeste, after viewing her husband's body, had become hysterical, screaming, tearing at her hair, and requiring restraint by both Louisa and Margot before Dr. Fentress could administer laudanum. The Greenleaf brothers posted themselves in the study as guards, though what they were guarding against was unclear. Moses took charge of practical arrangements, sending riders to notify Henry's brother in Baton Rouge and the parish priest, organizing the household staff to begin preparations for the funeral, and ensuring that nothing in the study was disturbed until proper authorities could investigate. It was Moses's calm efficiency during this crisis that first raised suspicions in Tobias Greenleaf's mind. A man's master had just died violently, yet Moses showed no visible distress, no disruption to his usual methodical competence. He gave orders as if he had anticipated this moment, as if he had already thought through every necessary step. When Greenleaf mentioned this observation to his brother later that morning, Samuel responded with a question that would echo through subsequent events. "How long do you think Moses has been waiting for this?" The official investigation began at dawn. Sheriff Antoine Terreau arrived from the parish seat accompanied by 2 deputies and a justice of the peace named Aldrich Boudreau. They examined the study, questioned the household, and reviewed Dr. Fentress' preliminary findings. By noon, they had reached their conclusion. Henry Botch had taken his own life while intoxicated and despondent over financial troubles. The verdict satisfied legal requirements and preserved the family's reputation. Suicide was scandal enough without adding suggestions of foul play or household conspiracy, but several people found the official verdict difficult to accept. Tobias Greenleaf insisted that Henry had shown no signs of despondency and had in fact been enthusiastic about upcoming business ventures. Henry's brother, Armand, who arrived late on the 18th, pointed out that the family's finances were actually quite healthy, something he verified by reviewing the estate's account books with Moses. Dr. Fentress privately maintained his reservations about certain physical evidence, and Louisa, who had served the Beauchamp family for 45 years, told anyone who would listen that Henry was not the type of man who would abandon his responsibilities through suicide, no matter what troubles he faced. Yet the inquiry was closed, the death certificate was signed, and preparations for Henry's burial proceeded. According to Louisiana law and Catholic custom, he should have been interred quickly, but the heat was intense, and Armand insisted on delaying the funeral until more family members could travel from New Orleans. Henry's body was placed in a sealed coffin in the Plantation's ice house, and the funeral was scheduled for June 22nd. During those 5 days between death and burial, Belleair Plantation existed in a strange state of suspension. All normal work continued. The fields still required tending. The mill still operated. The household still functioned. But everyone understood that fundamental change was coming. The question was what form that change would take. Armand had legal authority as Henry's closest male relative, but he lived in Baton Rouge and had his own affairs to manage. Celeste was Henry's widow and would inherit significant assets, but Louisiana law restricted women's control over property, and she showed no capacity or desire to manage a plantation. The Greenleaf brothers assumed they would step into positions of greater authority, but they needed someone to sign their orders, someone with legal standing. Moses continued managing daily operations as he had under Henry, and everyone accepted this arrangement because the alternative was chaos. He met with Armand to review accounts, corresponded with Hersfactor in New Orleans about existing contracts, and made decisions about planting schedules that could not wait for resolution of the estate. He did all of this with the same calm competence he had always shown, and people began to forget, or perhaps they never truly believed, that his legal status had not changed. He was still enslaved. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every signature he placed on documents had no legal authority whatsoever. On June 21st, the evening before Henry's funeral, Moses requested a private meeting with Celeste. They met in the small parlor off the main hall, the same room where Henry had once conducted business with visiting planters. Margot stood outside the closed door. Propriety required a witness to any meeting between a white woman and an enslaved man, but she later testified that she could not hear what was discussed. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. When Moses emerged, his expression revealed nothing. When Celeste emerged 10 minutes later, she looked as if she had made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. The funeral took place on a Wednesday afternoon with heat so oppressive that several attendees fainted during the graveside service. Father Dominique Leblanc conducted the ceremony, speaking of Henry's contributions to the parish, his business acumen, and his devotion to the Southern cause. He did not mention suicide. Such things were not discussed openly, but everyone present understood the implications of the carefully chosen words about God's mercy and the mysterious trials that test even the strongest souls. Armand Beauchamp departed immediately after the funeral, explaining that urgent business required his return to Baton Rouge. Before leaving, he had a brief conversation with Tobias Greenleaf in which he stated that the plantation's management would remain under current arrangements until the estate was properly settled. What those current arrangements were exactly, he did not specify. Greenleaf understood that he was being told to accept Moses's continued authority, at least temporarily, and this understanding did nothing to diminish his growing resentment. That evening, as the household was settling after the exhausting day, Louisa was cleaning Henry's study, a task she had delayed as long as possible, when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The hunting rifle that had killed Henry was back in its usual place above the desk. She was certain it had been taken as evidence by Sheriff Theet. She was even more certain that she had not seen anyone return it. She mentioned this to Moses, who told her that Armand had arranged for its return before departing. This explanation was reasonable, yet something about the way Moses delivered it, or perhaps something about the way the rifle, now hung, cleaned and oiled as if waiting to be used again, left Louisa profoundly uneasy. One other detail from that day deserves mention. Late in the evening, after most of the household had retired, Margot was helping Celeste prepare for bed when she noticed that her mistress was wearing a necklace Margot had never seen before. It was a simple piece, a gold chain with a small locket, old-fashioned in style, but well crafted. When Margot asked about it, Celeste touched it absently and said it had belonged to her grandmother. Margot did not press the question, though she thought it odd that Celeste would choose to wear a new piece of jewelry on the day of her husband's funeral. She did not know, could not have known, that inside the locket was a small curl of dark hair and a folded paper containing 7 words written in Moses's distinctive hand. What we have begun cannot be undone. The weeks following Enra's death revealed fractures in Bel-Air's social structure that had always existed beneath the surface, but had been held in check by the weight of established authority. With that authority removed, every relationship, every assumption, every unspoken arrangement came into question. The plantation did not collapse immediately. That would come later, but it began a slow transformation that alarmed everyone who understood what they were witnessing. Moses continued to run Bel-Air's operations with an efficiency that even the Greenleaf brothers could not fault. The crops were tended, the mill operated profitably. Contracts with New Orleans factors were maintained, and the estate's accounts showed continued income. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had changed. Moses no longer sought approval for his decisions, no longer presented plans for someone else to authorize. He simply acted, and the momentum of habit and the absence of clear alternative authority meant that people accepted his actions as legitimate. Celeste remained secluded in the main house, appearing only for meals and necessary social obligations. She met weekly with Father Leblanc, who visited to provide spiritual comfort during her mourning period. She received condolence calls from neighboring plantation wives, though these visits became less frequent as rumors began to circulate about her relationship with Moses. She wore black, observed the proper forms of widowhood, and gave no outward indication that she was anything other than a grieving wife awaiting settlement of her husband's estate. But those who worked in the main house knew better. Margot, whose position as Celeste's personal maid gave her intimate access to her mistress's private life, observed meetings between Celeste and Moses that occurred with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of propriety. They met in the parlor in Ori's former study on the gallery in the evening. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in French, which Moses had somehow learned despite having no formal education. They reviewed documents together, documents that Margot glimpsed but could not read, papers covered with legal language and official seals. Louisa noticed changes in the household's operation that suggested a shift in authority. Celeste began making decisions about provisions, about which servants should be assigned to which tasks, about matters that widows typically left to male relatives or overseers. But her decisions were never announced directly. They came through Moses, delivered with such matter of act confidence that people complied before questioning whether Celeste actually had the authority to make such determinations. The Greenleaf brothers recognized that their position was being undermined, but they struggled to articulate exactly how or to identify a specific violation they could challenge. Moses gave them no direct orders that would have been an inexcusable breach of racial hierarchy. Instead, he simply informed them of decisions that had been made, changes that would be implemented, arrangements that were now in place. When they protested, he referred them to Celeste, who confirmed that yes, these changes had her approval as mistress of the estate. When they questioned whether Celeste had the legal authority to approve such changes, Moses pointed out that the estate was still in probate and that Armand Beauchamp had explicitly stated that current arrangement should continue. By late July, Tobias Greenleaf had become convinced that Moses was manipulating Celeste, possibly through threats, possibly through some other form of coercion he could not quite define. He shared these suspicions with his brother, with several neighboring overseers, and eventually with Sheriff Theot during a chance meeting in the parish seat. The sheriff listened politely, but pointed out that suspicion was not evidence, and unless Greenleaf could demonstrate actual wrongdoing, actual crime, there was nothing the law could do. The sheriff also reminded him with careful emphasis that making unfounded accusations about a white woman's honor could have severe legal consequences for the accuser. On August 3rd, something occurred that brought these simmering tensions to a brief, explosive confrontation. Moses had arranged the sale of 60 hogsheads of sugar to a New Orleans factor at a price significantly higher than Henry had negotiated for the previous year's crop. This was objectively good business, but Tobias Greenleaf chose to challenge the transaction, arguing that Moses had no authority to negotiate contracts and that the sale should be voided. Moses calmly explained that he had negotiated the deal on Celeste's behalf with her full knowledge and approval, and that the contract had already been signed and the first payment received. Greenleaf, his frustration finally boiling over, made the mistake of explicitly stating what many had been thinking. "You forget your place, Moses. You forget what you are." The confrontation took place in the mill office with half a dozen witnesses present. Moses's response was quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. "My place is wherever Madame Bostrom determines it to be. If you question my authority, you question hers. If you question hers, you question the arrangements made by Monsieur Arm before his departure. If you wish to challenge those arrangements, I suggest you travel to Baton Rouge and discuss the matter with him directly. Until you do so, I will continue to perform the duties assigned to me by the mistress of this estate." It was a masterful piece of verbal maneuvering, simultaneously invoking multiple sources of authority while offering no direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that everyone understood governed their world. Greenleaf was trapped. He could not challenge Moses without appearing to challenge Celeste, could not challenge Celeste without appearing to exceed his own authority, could not appeal to Armand without admitting that he had lost control of the plantation he was supposed to be supervising. That same evening, Tobias Greenleaf began drafting a letter to Armand Bostrom detailing his concerns about Moses's growing influence and requesting clarification about the estate's management structure. He was still working on this letter when 2 days later he fell ill with symptoms that Dr. Fentress initially diagnosed as cholera, severe intestinal distress accompanied by vomiting, fever, and delirium. The illness came on suddenly, progressed rapidly, and proved fatal within 48 hours. Tobias Greenleaf died on August 7, 1852, 3 days after his confrontation with Moses. Cholera was not uncommon in Louisiana during summer months, particularly near the river. The same week Greenleaf died, 2 slaves from a neighboring plantation and a merchant in the parish seat also succumbed to similar symptoms. Dr. Fentress saw no reason to suspect foul play, though he noted in his records that the speed and severity of Greenleaf's decline was unusual, even for cholera. The body was buried quickly. The heat and the nature of the illness made this necessary, and Samuel Greenleaf found himself suddenly elevated to the position of sole overseer. Samuel lacked his brother's forceful personality and his certainty about how things should be. He had relied on Tobias to make difficult decisions, to confront problems directly, to maintain the firm hand that everyone agreed was necessary in managing a large plantation. Without his brother, Samuel felt adrift. When Moses approached him 3 days after the funeral with a proposal to restructure the overseer's responsibilities, ostensibly to reduce Samuel's workload during this difficult period, Samuel agreed without fully considering the implications. The new arrangement gave Samuel authority over field operations while Moses retained control of business affairs, contracts, and financial management. It was, Moses explained, simply a formal recognition of how things had been operating. Anyway, what Samuel did not realize until too late was that he had just accepted a subordinate position. The person who controls money and contracts controls everything else. Moses now had official, or at least officially recognized, authority over the plantation's most important operations, while Samuel was relegated to supervising manual labor. It was a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, accomplished so smoothly that Samuel only understood what had happened after the arrangement was already in place and functioning. Throughout these developments, one person watched with increasingly sharp attention and growing alarm. Old Jacks, who had cooked for the Beauchamp family for longer than most people on the plantation, had been alive, had seen changes of power before. He had watched Omri's father die and Hurai assumed control. He had observed hirings and firings, marriages and deaths, the constant small negotiations of authority that occurred in any large household. But what he was witnessing now was different. This was not evolution. This was revolution conducted so gradually that most people did not recognize it as such. Jacks began paying attention to things that others overlooked. He noticed that Celeste no longer took her meals in the formal dining room, but instead ate in her private chambers, with Margot bringing trays that Moses had personally selected from Jax's kitchen. He observed that Margot carried notes between Moses and Celeste several times each day, more communication than would seem necessary for simple household management. He saw that Louisa, who had once held undisputed authority over the household staff, now consulted with Moses before making decisions about staffing or supplies. Most troubling of all, Jax noticed that people were disappearing. Not literally disappearing, nothing so dramatic, but gradually being removed from positions where they might observe or interfere with whatever was unfolding. 3 house servants had been reassigned to field work, a change that Moses explained as necessary due to reduced household needs during mourning. 2 field workers known for their loyalty to the Greenleaf brothers had been sold to a neighboring plantation, a transaction Moses described as financially advantageous. The butler, who had served Henry for 15 years, had been dismissed for drunkenness, a charge that Louisa privately disputed, but could not disprove. When Jack mentioned these observations to Louisa, she responded with something that surprised him. Fear, not anger, not indignation, but genuine fear. Do not speak of these things, she told him. Do not even think them too loudly. There are changes coming that we cannot prevent, and the only safety is in not noticing them. On September 12, 1852, exactly 12 weeks after Henry Beausamp's death, Moses appeared before Justice Boudreau in the parish seat, accompanied by Celeste and a lawyer from New Orleans named Edward Lafleur. The purpose of their visit was to present documents related to Henry's estate and to request the court's approval of certain arrangements. The documents included Henry's will, which had apparently been revised just 2 months before his death, a power of attorney granting Celeste authority to manage the estate during probate, and a manumission paper for Moses signed by Henry and dated April 15, 1852. The will was straightforward enough. It left the bulk of Henry's estate to Celeste with provisions for his brother Armand and small bequests to several friends and distant relatives. Nothing in the will was unusual for a man without children. The power of attorney was also unremarkable.